So I'm very happy to introduce you the first keynote speaker. The first keynote speaker is David Steiner from Johns Hopkins University from the US. The title of his speech is A Retreat from Knowledge, the Strange Condition of Education in the United States. David is Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and Professor of Education at Johns Hopkins University in the US. In 2020, he finished serving as a member of the Maryland State Board of Education. He currently serves on the board of the Relay Graduate School of Education and to the Practitioner Council at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. In 2009, Dr. Steiner was appointed Commissioner of Education for New York State. In 2005, as Dean at the Hunter College School of Education. His most recent book, A Nation, a Thought, Restoring Wisdom in America's Schools, was published last year. So I'm very happy to give to David Steiner the floor and to listen his keynote speech, A Retreat from Knowledge, the Strange Condition of Education in the United States. Thank you very much, David, to be here with us.
Thank you so much, Francesca and Nicole, University of Bergamo, for your warm hospitality, and good morning to you all. In her essay, The Crisis in Education, Hannah Arendt asks the most important possible question: is education any longer possible? And her answer essentially is no. The problem, she writes, of education in the modern world lies in the fact that by its very nature, we cannot forego, cannot be without, either authority or tradition, and yet we must proceed in a world that is neither structured by authority nor held together by tradition. Why are authority and tradition so important to the act of educating? Arendt argues that child-centered or progressivist models of education devalue authority in ways that undermine the very possibility of education. All the rules of sound human reasoning, she writes, are cast aside. Her criticism of progressivism has three parts. First, child-centered education entrusts authority in education to those who by nature cannot exercise it, namely children. She stresses the helplessness of every child that instinctively seeks authority to guide her or him into the world in which he or she is still a stranger, in which she cannot orient herself by her own judgment. Second, we adults, in choosing to give power to children to shape their own education, have devalued our own knowledge. If teachers abandon the teaching of their knowledge, then teachers remove, they sacrifice the one source of authority that should be theirs. Finally, constructivism rests on the belief that a child can only understand what they have, quote, discovered by themselves, close quote. But that's not true. It's simply not true. Think about learning to read. It's not a natural process. It must be taught. But, Arendt says, the incorrect belief that children can only learn by self-discovery leads to a substitution of doing for learning, a damaging replacement, she writes, of thoughtful work by labor without direction. Our progressivist impulse to make sacred, to make autonomous the world of the child is, in Hannah Arendt's view, a symptom of something more serious, more fundamental. Adults give up authority because we refuse, she writes, to assume responsibility for the world into which we have brought our children. What does Arendt mean by giving up responsibility for our world? And why does she believe that doing so destroys our capacity to educate children? Her answer, to simplify if I may, is that when we educate, we must take responsibility for which stories, which information, which picture about our world we are going to pass on to our children. But today, Arendt argues, we are estranged, alienated from our own histories. There is no coherent narrative, no shared set of stories about our world of which we are willing to say, this story, these stories are worthy of teaching to our children. We live in a culture, Arendt argues, in which there is a crisis in our attitude towards the realm of the past. We are no longer prepared to introduce children into the unfolding stories of which they are a part, and in the context of which children can, one day, remake their world. Without a shared, valued narrative about the world, children will remain ignorant of how to act. They will be like bats without a cave. They will have no way in which to find and then judge the limits of their world. Arendt insists, quote, that exactly for the sake of what is new and revolutionary in every child, education must be conservative. It must preserve the newness and introduce the world as a new thing to the child. Paradoxically, Arendt reminds us that in its most creative, revolutionary period, American education was most conservative. Today, she writes, educational experiments have struck a very revolutionary pose, but that pose, she says, will leave children without the ability to act radically. Today, an insistence on selecting and teaching a particular cultural content to our children is under deep suspicion, especially from the political left. Thus, Arendt's argument that choosing a particular content, a curriculum, for our children's education, her argument that doing so is not conservative requires support. To use America as our example, I would remind us that the most important figures of protest in the struggle for civil rights, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, each affirmed the centrality of classical learning in their resistance, in their voice of resistance. You may remember that Malcolm X dropped out of school when he was 13, but when imprisoned for robbery, he taught himself to read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche, among many others. To the American list, I would add one more powerful example, that of Nelson Mandela. When he was imprisoned in South Africa in Robben Island, he chose to play both the role of Creon and Antigone in Sophocles' play of that name. He recalled later that he found the experience of studying that play, and indeed classical literature more generally, as, quote, enormously elevating, close quote. Sophocles, he said, had much to teach him about power, despotism, politics, courage, and faith. To repeat her central claim, the authority of the teacher then rests on the assumption of responsibility for our world. Our intellectual irresponsibility when it comes to education lies in our unwillingness to select to be responsible for content worth teaching. We betray ourselves as parents and educators in pretending that children can be made the authors of their world. In what Arendt bluntly calls our disgust for our world, we wash our hands of our authority, our responsibility, and our love both for our children and for our world. Arendt ties this surrender of the core responsibility of the teacher, our unwillingness to be responsible for choosing the content of education, to our unwillingness to judge what is of value in human experience. I now want to stress that the unwillingness to say this content is worth teaching is not a theoretical issue alone. In the United States, at least, the flight from responsibility is powerfully and destructively evident in our preference for skills over curricular content. We do not have, in our nation as a whole, or in any one of our 50 states, a single shared curriculum in any subject. No defined content in literature, or history, or science, or even mathematics. Because there is no set curriculum, because we do not require students to read a list of books, our state tests of reading, for example, cannot test knowledge of any specific text. We cannot ask questions about Moby Dick or The Great Gatsby or The Bluest Eye, for example. Instead, our tests present students with a paragraph or two from a very obscure source that no student has ever read before, so no student has an advantage. We then ask students to, quote, find the main idea in the paragraph. Of course, this ability depends on understanding what the text is about. And it turns out that wealthier, richer students do much better in finding the main idea because they have more knowledge about the world. So the reading test in America becomes a test of family wealth. We can predict quite well a student's results on a test if we know their parents' wealth. Because poor students do badly, we try to train them on find the main idea instead of teaching them content. And as a result, every year they do worse and worse. In our shift over the last 100 years from content to skill, America is following, unfortunately, the example set in France when it passed the Loi Jospin, when it gave up the national curriculum for a shift to child-centered progressive pedagogy. Here is what happened to the performance of children in reading in France. These lines represent the reading skills of children from different economic groups, the wealthiest children at the top, the poorest children at the bottom, from the time the law was passed in 1987 to 20 years later in 2007. What you can see is that the shift to child-centered education damaged the reading of every group of students, but what is most tragic is that it damaged the reading of poorest students the most. That is the bottom line. Sadly, it has become fashionable to follow Jospin's example. For example, Finland, where excellent educational achievements were built on a strong, content-rich national curriculum, this was given up. As a result, just like in France, there has in the last few years been a steady decline in educational results. England went through the same thing before it went back to a content-rich curriculum. The United States has done the same thing, but in the United States, we have gone further. Not only have we embraced empty skills instead of content, we have in the last 10 years become enchanted with the idea that even teaching academic skills may be very old-fashioned. Instead, an ever-increasing number of teachers, supported by a very thin research base, have been embracing a very different agenda. The following slide summarizes the new pedagogy in America. I'll give you a moment to look at these wonderful examples. As I lay out in my recent book, there is very little serious research to support any of these ideas. To take one example, it should be obvious, but apparently it is not, that one cannot think critically about nothing in particular. We need to have some knowledge to think critically about. Or take the 21st century skills. It sounds very relevant, very sexy. Well, it turns out that 21st century skills are a long, long list of everything that you want in a human being. Reliability, capacity to motivate, capacity to work in teams, information literacy, communication skills, cross-cultural sensitivity, flexibility, accountability, maybe clean socks. It is an endless list. The United States has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the collective search to do something, anything other than teach core academic content. But the impact has been deeply negative. After some real progress in the 1980s and the 1990s, progress, especially for the poorest students, has stopped. Here are the math results for our high school students. As you can see, the United States has made exactly zero progress since 1992. Zero. This is despite the fact that we have spent more dollars in real dollars after inflation, far more than we did in 1992. But the situation, while it's bad in mathematics, is much worse when it comes to students' knowledge of history and civics. In this, as you see on the slide, in 2018, just 25% of 13-year-olds in America passed the civics test. This is the lowest result in the United States of any subject matter test, right? It's worse than reading, worse than math, worse than science. In other words, the result is bad across the board. But for African American and Hispanic students, it's a disaster. The pass rate is 10% and 13% for those two groups. Now, this is, again, not just a theoretical problem. As you can see in the second paragraph, the Center for Civic Education found in a major survey that just 30% of Americans born since 1980, so the younger generation, believe it's essential to live in a democracy. I just want that to sink in for a moment, right? So 70% of our younger Americans do not think it's particularly important to live in a democracy. We may see the results in the next presidential election. One might think that confronted by these results, there would be widespread distress over our educational outcomes in the United States. After all, in math and science, America's international results are very embarrassing. We do worse, for example, in mathematics than Vietnam, a country we left in ruins. But instead, America has discovered a deeply sophisticated way to handle bad news. It simply reports bad news as good news. What do I mean? Remember that the exam results of American high school students has been flat since 1990 or so. Now, if you have flat results, you would assume that the grades we give to American students, A, B, C, D, would be flat, right? Flat results, flat grades. Oh, no. No, in America, while the results have been flat, we have given ever higher grades to our American students. That's those lines going upwards. It's a very strange thing if you think about it. Why should we give higher and higher grades to the same result? Not only have we done this in high school, we've also done it in university. We have grade inflation in the United States. What does grade inflation actually mean? Grade inflation means simply that we call today success what 20 years ago we called failure. We have gone up a complete grade in the United States. It's a fiction. It's a complete myth. It's a mythology. It's as if we can't take bad news, so we simply call it good. It's beyond embarrassing. It's a lie that damages children, because much later in life, they find out that they don't have the knowledge they need. To summarize our argument so far, America's decision to embrace skills over content has damaged student learning. Sympathetic to Arendt's argument, I have been for some time a critic of this flight, this retreat from content, this refusal to make judgments about what is worth learning. But where does this flight from educational responsibility, this unwillingness to make judgments about content, come from? Arendt locates this inability to judge, this refusal to act in judgment, in thinking itself, in the retreat from thinking. She writes, the precondition for judging is the disposition, the habit, to live explicitly or consciously with oneself, to have dialogue with oneself, to be engaged in that silent dialogue between me and myself, which she says, since Socrates and Plato, we call thinking. To illustrate this silent dialogue, Arendt cites Plato's Gorgias, when Socrates says his deepest fear is, quote, that I, being one, should be out of tune with myself and contradict myself, close quote. The meaning is clear. Even though I am one person, I am not simply one person. I have a self and I am related to myself. This self is not an illusion. It makes itself heard by talking. I talk to myself. That is what thinking is. If I do wrong, this is Arendt and Plato, the key point is not that somebody else will find me guilty, that somebody else will scold me. The point is I have to live with that wrongdoer. I have to be in this, and this is Arendt's phrase, unbearable intimacy. I can never get rid of myself. Invited by thought into a lifelong dialogue with myself, thinking is done in solitude. This is not loneliness, this is solitude. It is the responsibility of the educator to judge which content to teach a child so that the child's developing internal dialogue of self with self is not empty, random, or filled with noise, but is supplied with what is worth something, the content of thought. But please note, too, that we have slipped, almost without noticing, into the realm of ethics. If the content of my thought is unworthy, if it is trash, my habits of thought are thus debased. I'm condemned to be in that unbearable intimacy with my own emptiness, my own worthlessness. Once again, the United States offers us a vivid and disturbing model. The average teenager in the United States today is on social media for almost 8 hours every day. That's the most recent data. That's longer than they are in a school setting. It means they're coming home and they're right on the machine and they stay on the machine. While school is focused in America on offering often content-empty skills, it is social media that supplies the content of thought, unsupervised by adults. There are no boundaries for the content that floods the smartphone or the computer. Once upon a time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in the Emile that children needed to experience limits. He called them walls of bronze, close quote. Today, those walls have collapsed, and the child is flooded by the chaos, the cacophony, the noise of the world. The internal space, the dialogue of the child with herself collapses under this avalanche. The result, unsurprisingly, is the rapid growth in the United States of childhood depression and an increasing unwillingness, made worse by COVID, to attend school at all. Today in Baltimore, where I live, some 65% of high school students are chronically absent from school, meaning they miss more than 10% of school days. Competing with the content of the internet, the skills-based education cannot compete. It is too boring, too fragmented, too empty. It does not create ideas that are worth holding in mind. Above all, with some exceptions, especially if students are lucky enough to have strong science teachers, it does not provide material for serious thinking. Other animals reproduce, hunt, build homes, communicate, remember, experience emotions as we do. But human beings alone can evaluate in language our own actions and those of others, appreciate beauty, acquire facilities in different fields of knowledge, be they literate, mathematical, historical, scientific, or those expressed in musical or other artistic or physical forms. Only human beings can think reflectively about the direction, the unfolding trajectory of our lives. Without a well-developed capacity for such thoughtfulness, life becomes a matter of chance. A life lived at the mercy of instinct, of unfiltered emotion, is the life of a human puppet, directed by forces of chance and circumstance. In his work, Plato famously compares such human beings to puppets whose strings are pulled by the gods. The most fundamental purpose of education is thus to nurture our capacity to think. Education is the means by which our most human capabilities are transformed from just potential to a life in which we can interrogate our experience so as to learn and integrate our experience into future action. Michael Oakeshott, philosopher and political theorist, put it this way, I quote, "The price of the intelligent activity which constitutes being human is learning. When the human condition is said to be burdensome, heavy, what is being pointed out is not the mere necessity of having to think, to speak, and to act, instead of merely being like a stone or growing like a tree, but the impossibility of thinking or feeling without having slowly and often painfully learned to think something." While the need for a good education can be defended for many reasons, including both economic and civic, our most essential responsibility as educators involves the guiding, the careful nurturing of children's learning to think. The argument of my recent book is that there are three crucial elements in the education of thought: learning academic content, we've talked about this in literature, history, math, and science at least, an education in ethics, and an education in aesthetics. Our schools need to nurture the capacity for academic learning, ethical reflection, and aesthetic sensibility because they are crucial to forging a fulfilling life. I can only sketch that argument today. We've already discussed our refusal to take responsibility for the rich content of education, the core of academic learning. We now briefly will consider ethics and then turn to aesthetics. The founding American hope, now exported to the world, is that our lives might enable the pursuit of happiness. But what exactly does that mean? Surely not that we do anything at all without thought. 24 centuries ago, Aristotle coined the term eudaimonia, human flourishing, to describe the concept of happiness. Eudaimonia, Aristotle argued, is the highest, the most important of human ends, the purpose of our existence. A well-lived life is one in which the aim of happiness or human flourishing is our North Star, guiding our choice, our values, our hopes, our dreams. A well-lived life, an ethical life, Aristotle insists, is about making wise choices. If they are well educated in ethics, human beings will have learned to weigh the consequences of their choices in terms of how the outcomes will affect the pathway, the life of their life story, the values that they will embrace. Aristotle argues that in making choices that will shape the future direction of our life, well-educated humans will seek out opportunities to be involved in actions that are courageous, generous, and honorable. As you know, Aristotle calls the act of choosing or reasoning about one's actions phronesis, usually translated as intellectual virtue of exercising practical wisdom. When we exercise it, we combine the careful consideration of the pathway of our life and a commitment to understanding the virtuous course of actions in reaching our goals. Education worthy of the name is crucial to phronesis because it is through education that children, through repetition that becomes habit, come to enjoy virtuous actions. They will want to forge paths of living in which they can enjoy what a virtuous life can offer. In other words, they will have learned to desire and thus seek to make the opportunities for a good life. Aristotle's key point is this: if adults are one day to successfully deliberate, think about what is good, they must already have come to enjoy doing what is just, courageous, honest as children. In short, they will have developed a moral compass. In Aristotle's words, a good upbringing makes the noble a part, perhaps the chief part, of what is good in us. How do we acquire this enjoyment of ethical choice-making? First, through lived experience. This is why, to cite him once again, Rousseau's Émile, the tutor of the boy organizes the experience of the child so that Émile experiences the connection between wise actions and their positive consequences. But secondly, ethical choice-making is developed through more formal education, through stories, myths, history that enable children to inhabit multiple worlds beyond their own horizons, to derive thoughtful lessons from those stories, which will serve their own developing capacities for phronesis as they mature. The curriculum we devise for our young children, the tales we tell them or we read to them before they think for themselves, are not simply devices to enable them to master the mechanics of reading, important though that is, but a key reference point for an education in ethics. Through their capacity to imagine, children place themselves in previously unimagined and unexpected worlds. They associate with characters in the stories they read and take their experiences to heart. The resulting lessons are ethically crucial. Children in that imaginative space rehearse the consequences of fictional or historical characters that they read about, learning about the consequences of decisions made with too little thought or wise choices that lead to well-lived lives. That is what phronesis consists in, a conscious effort to slow down, to rehearse various pathways, to ask tough questions of oneself, to enable the imagination to draw on multiple possibilities, to deepen one's awareness, in short, to be thoughtful. Today, particularly in the United States, we've given up on ethical education. We tried something called character education in the 1980s, early 90s. We've let that go. We've simply turned our back on one of the most essential tasks of education, to provide an ethical compass. And now aesthetics. A life lived without an educated attunement to the beautiful will be as if the very colors of one's life's experiences are washed out. Children deserve opportunities to nourish their imagination, to respond to the beautiful in the outside world or a museum, playing a musical instrument, crafting a sculpture, mastering a dance, or perspective in painting. To have to argue for an education in aesthetics is surprising given its fundamental value to human sensibility. But it is also vital since today it has so little standing in so many of our schools, at least in the United States. We have in America created a class system of subjects. Math and reading somehow is first class. Science and history, second class. We sometimes test them, we sometimes don't. Everything else is third class. Everything from philosophy to arts to physical education to computer, it's all third class. Immanuel Kant is compelling on the topic of aesthetics. In making aesthetics judgments, as Kant sees it, we are in the realm of free choice. We cannot appeal to some scientific principle or proof that something is worthy of being called beautiful. We are just on our own with our experiences to rely on. This is because, he says, when we make aesthetic judgments that this painting is beautiful, nothing is given. Thinking doesn't determine in advance our own experience. We are free to act, to react to the painting as we please. But that produces a major problem. Are aesthetic judgments just a matter of private opinion, like I like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla? Kant rejects this view. He claims that when we make aesthetic judgments, we are doing something very, very different. We are responding to something deep in human nature. And that response is so strong that we find we want to share our response with other people, with each other. When I say this is beautiful, I make a claim not just for myself, but for all humanity. As we encounter the objects, our thoughts about it come together in a positive and powerful urge to share with others. We are convinced that they too should be struck by the quality of what has been created. Don't you see, don't you hear how beautiful this is? What occurs inside our mind when we are moved by the beauty of an object, when it evokes this powerful urge to celebrate, retain, and communicate our experience? Kant suggests that at that moment, both our facilities of imagination and understanding are equally active. If an object creates an experience of what Kant calls the harmony of understanding and imagination, we feel that unity as a deep pleasure, an experience of beauty. A vast literature suggests that in his discussion of how imagination and cognition or thought come together in a moment of appreciation of beauty, this account is not without problems. In fact, in one point in his famous Third Critique, which is talking about aesthetic judgment, Kant stops and says, I'm not sure I understand what I'm writing. So maybe we too. But as he describes this aesthetic experience, he is also talking about something very familiar to us. A piece of music or art startles us out of indifference, out of complacency. We are drawn to it powerfully. We may make some effort to describe it, but that effort gives way before just the experience of the painting. We are amazed, delighted, horrified. The British philosopher Peter de Bolle describes an example of this aesthetic experience as he stands in front of Barnett Newman's abstract painting, Vir Heroicus Sublimus, Man Heroic and Sublime. He writes as follows, "The image seems to compose me, to generate a sense of well-being," close quote. Here, de Bolle describes both an emotional response and a sense that the painting was offering him new forms of thought. The painting creates the feeling like one is knowing something, a heightened sense of the self being well composed. That is aesthetic knowing feeling which de Bolle places between pure emotion and thinking, or in plain English, between thinking and thought, is very powerful, even if we cannot fully understand or define it. De Bolle's experience in front of this painting bears witness to what Kant described as an encounter with the truly beautiful. De Bolle invites us to see the painting and share the experience. As he does so, he's recalling something very personal, his reaction to looking at the painting, but his claim is that all of us can have that experience. Compared to the exercise of simply reporting facts about the canvas, an exercise in which my engagement is quite weak, the effort of evoking an aesthetic claim is searching and demanding. It involves translating something very private into a shareable language, into what de Bolle calls a mutual terrain. The experience of sharing can be a powerful invitation to community, to inclusivity. These aren't just theoretical claims. In 2021, researchers from the United States and Germany examined the reaction of many hundreds of students from the US, the UK, and India while looking at an image or listening to music or recalling a personal experience of beauty. The results of the research closely echo Kant's philosophical model. I quote, "Top-rated beauty experiences are strongly characterized by intense pleasure, an impression of universality, the wish to continue the experience, exceeding expectation, and harmony in the variety and meaning of the experience." As Kant suggests, the language of thought and emotions are not separated, but together at once. A child becomes conscious of what is in front of her. Trying to produce the sound on a violin, she struggles, knowing it's not there yet. She experiences her own knowing struggle as frustration, but she wants to succeed to communicate the sound to us all. Or to take another example from the visual arts, imagine a student in front of a Rothko painting in a museum. There's no immediate meaning to the painting, and the tendency of a student, particularly today, is just to keep walking. The teacher has to stop the student, place the student in front of the painting, and enable the process of imagination and thought. Aesthetic education is above all an exhilarating experience of losing the self in an encounter, only to return to an enlarged and deepened self. This sounds theoretical, but it can be seen every day. In the 94th aphorism of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, he calls it the seriousness, another translation is the intensity, of a child at play. You've all seen it. The intensity, the energy, the loss and recovery of a self comes from this energy that is fed by engagement with the experience. To offer students a rich set of such aesthetic experiences is a core value of education. Martin Heidegger, German philosopher, emphasizes the interaction between aesthetic judgment and thinking, writing that our encounters with objects that are beautiful is not merely a matter of feeling, but are, I quote, amongst the most thought-provoking of all encounters. Aesthetic experiences also have ethical dimensions. As the cultural critic Roger Kimball reminds us, when we share aesthetic responses with one another, we are reminded powerfully of our common humanity, of our capacity to share freely a sense of beauty that elevates us as human beings. Or, in the words of Dante from the Purgatorio, Canto 18, beauty awakens the soul to act. Thought, ethics, and beauty, or so I would argue, are three intertwined and crucial elements of an education worthy of the name. To give up on making judgments about and then teaching a challenging, content-rich curriculum, to leave ethical development to chance, to turn one's back on an education in beauty, is to portray what it means to be a teacher. This three-part surrender, because knowledge, ethics, and aesthetics are intertwined, is not a beautiful gift we give to the freedom of our children. It is simply to announce the loss of our role as teachers. In the United States today, we have developed a habit of teaching that's very different. And I want to re-enter, as we move towards our close, this contemporary educational politics. We have turned our back on knowledge of the canon, of essential texts, and I have argued with Hannah Arendt that this is not in any way a radical move. It is, in fact, to give up on enabling children to prepare for radical action. Today in the United States, the argument is we must focus on teaching multiculturalism. Faced with students from all over the world, from many national, ethnic, religious, and racial origins, our education, and you've heard this 1,000 times, must respect their differences, But a moment's thought should tell us that this has become educationally impossible. We were once told that we are to be very respectful, sensitive to Hispanic culture. Sounded reasonable, right? 22 million Hispanic students. We are now reminded, however, of the deep differences, correctly, between Jamaicans and Hispanics, or Hispanics and Latinos. We should realize that Cubans and Dominicans cannot be regarded as sharing the same identity. And so the list goes on, more and more differences, with the logical conclusion that perhaps every child should be taught a unique cultural content. The result would be a complete fragmentation of the curriculum. The word humanities should remind us of our essential task, the education of human beings. Some 60 years ago, President Kennedy reminded Americans that, quote, "We all breathe the same air, we are all mortal, and we all cherish our children's future," close quote. If we no longer believe that texts can speak to all of us, if I cannot read Dante because I am not Italian and not Christian, if I cannot teach Dante to children because they are African American or Cuban, then I have turned my back on humanity, on an education in what is most essential, most beautiful, most instructive to leading a considered life. Education is not about flattering the color of my skin, or about celebrating the personality I happen to be, or ensuring that my sense of self is never upset or angered. We seem to have discovered a new right in the United States Constitution, a right not to be upset. I don't find it in the document. To educate does not close one's eyes to the sufferings of people or of nations. Evil, too, is woven into the human condition. Education's most essential task, however, is to draw myself out of myself, educare, to tell me the story of the human condition, enabling me to transcend the self I was as an ignorant child. An argument grounded in the humanities should perhaps come towards a close in poetry. In Canto 115, one of the most troubled, most gifted poets of the last century, writing in his 80s and imprisoned for treason, provided 4 lines that demand the education I've tried today to summon. The academic preparation to hear the core metaphor, to trace in his language the echoes of Homer and Dante, an ethical sensibility to hear the harsh self-condemnation of the poet and to forgive his madness, an aesthetic response to hear the beauty of the verse, and ultimately to education that still believes in the future of humanities, for which the dying, anguished, sick Ezra Pound still has hope. A blown husk that is finished, but the light sings eternal, a pale flare over marshes where the salt hay whispers to tide's change. A blown husk, Ezra himself, that is finished. His life is over. He has betrayed all his own values. But the light sings eternal. The light of the human condition of high culture is still there, is still singing. It's a pale flare. It is a delicate, fragile light over the marshes where the salt hay whispers to tide's change. The edge of the ocean. In his larger part of the canto, Pound is recalling the Odyssey, the return of Odysseus, the tides of the oceans of the world. To introduce, to teach such verse is what is meant by education. And so I say to all of you, to all the educators, to all the teachers here today, you have chosen a great calling. The life prospects, the imaginings, the interior furnishings, the cultural anime of your students' mind, the cultura anime of your students' minds, all of this is in your hands. Of course, there will be difficult days, very difficult days, as well as joyful ones. You will need what the great poet Paul Eluard called in French, le dur désir de durer, the difficult desire to endure. But each day, every day, remind yourself that on this day, your teaching may open a world to a young person, to a child. There is no greater privilege. I thank you.
Thank you, David, for such an inspiring speech. We have a few minutes for some brief question. If someone wants to start a very brief dialogue, Sarah has a microphone over there. Thank you, Sarah. Just raise your hand if you want say a brief question to David. Okay. In the first row, maybe we collect 3 or 4 questions for David.
As you wish.
David, thank you very much for for this inspiring presentation. I'm Erika Kopp from Budapest, Hungary. And I was really happy when I heard that you start with Hannah Arendt's work, because she is from this region, from this European region, and it's very important for us, her thoughts. My question is the following, because related to your statements about this knowledge, the missing knowledge in in the education of the United States. We have got a totally different experience. And I would like to go with my question from this experience, to expressing my experience. And I think most of those, they are from post-Soviet countries here. They have got a totally different experience, because as I see our education systems, although they are at a rhetorical level, this topic that we have to decrease the content in curriculum and in education, it didn't happen after these communist times. It's still there, overloaded. We have got enough knowledge, I think. I have to say, what you mentioned, Kant, we learned it in a secondary school. What you mentioned, Socrates, we learned it in a secondary school. So everything is there, but still we have got such a bad results. on reading, on mathematics, on everything. And we feel that for students, the knowledge what we submit, this knowledge for students, they are not relevant for them. And my question is, now I arrived to the question. So what do you think, how can we deal, because I agree with you that this knowledge question is crucial when we are thinking about the education. How can we deal with this power issue related to, who choose the power, the knowledge?
Thank you so much. Excellent question. First, I want to start with the most powerful criticism, which is this question of relevance, right? This drives me up the wall, as it won't surprise you to hear. If children were only interested in what was relevant, they would never read Harry Potter, they would never read The Lord of the Rings. Children love to escape. They love to be in imagined worlds. We in America seem to believe that education should be a mirror, right? That we should only see ourselves, whoever we happen to be. But that's to be imprisoned in the self. It is the irrelevant that takes us out of ourselves. That is what, the great books sounds very conservative, but the great books are the great books because they were disturbing, because they pushed through. Remember, Emile was burnt. Rousseau's Emile was burnt, right? Socrates was put to death. Nietzsche was regarded as insane before he even went insane. These great books take us out of ourselves. That's the point. Second, on the exam results, it is true that we have to teach children to read. This cannot be an accident. Finally, the one place America has made progress, the one place, is that we now take seriously teaching phonics, phonemic awareness, right? The mechanics of reading. The problem is we often do it with meaningless texts, right? Texts about nothing. So we sacrifice the opportunity to learn content while we're teaching reading. But we've managed to fragment, right, that knowledge base so they learn the mechanics of reading, but by the time they are 12, 13 years old, their reading results begin to decline because the knowledge isn't there. In mathematics, there's a huge war going on, how to teach math. The Chinese have one way, which seems to work. It's a dispute. Japanese start by being quite constructivist, but then very old-fashioned in the high school. It's a complicated story. So I would say, on your question, there are technical answers to how to teach the basic fundamental skill, but they do not undermine the greater argument for content. And by the way, in Russia and Hungary, before the revolution, math education was very strong, right? Russia did, compared to America, the results were much better. So nothing is perfect, but it was, the United States would be envious of Soviet Russian mathematics. Other questions, please? Don't be shy. Yes, there's a question over there.
Good morning. So
Morning.
thank you for your talk. My name is Marian. I'm from the Philippines, but I'm now doing my PhD in Italy. And I'd like to ask about, I grew up learning the canon, primarily in American educational systems. So we grew up very Anglo-American. How do you reconcile this? And I do agree that learning canon, learning Dante, Shakespeare is very important in developing the sensibility, this idea of ethics and aesthetics. But how do we also reconcile this colonial legacy? And, we do not replicate colonial forms of imperialism or cognitive imperialism. Yeah.
In my view, if a text is a slave to its context, it's not worth reading, right? The reason Nelson Mandela chose Sophocles is not, of course, because Sophocles was dead or white or male. He chose Sophocles because he could have chosen anything. He was in prison. He was facing what he thought would be a lifetime in prison. And the question was, what would be the play that he would put on with his fellow inmates, right, in the jail in South Africa? He could have chosen a story by a South African, African American. He could have chosen anything. He chose Sophocles because he found in that text more difficult, powerful, truthful, disturbing thinking about what mattered, right? About power, families, despotism, nations, religious faith, courage. So I believe that there are great texts from many, many places, many traditions, many languages. It is a great shame in the United States that we almost never read things in translation, right? If it's not in English, oh my God, right? You know, as if most of the world's literature doesn't exist. So I think the test of reading a text is it overwhelmed by its political context? Is it a work of imperialism first and last? Then why read it, right? If it is a work worth reading, it is innerly liberating for all humanity because it asks universal questions. That's my point about Kennedy, right? If you do not think that there are books, poems, art, music that speak to all of us, then you have given up on the humanities. You've given up on the idea of humanitas, of the idea that we are all finally more in common than we are different. The American metaphor used to be the melting pot, right? We would all become American. Today, it's called the salad bowl. This is a Californian idiocy, right? Because if you think about it, the idea of the salad bowl is somehow that you both are yourself and not yourself. It makes no sense, in fact, in educational terms. So I think the best answer to your question is simply, are you educated by reading this text? Or is it simply an affirmation of an ideology, of a political point of view, of a piece of race? In which case, no, it does not pass, and it should not be read in school. Other questions? Question. One more. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Valbona Nathanaeli from Albania. Thank you for you. I find it a little difficult to... Okay. Now, good morning again. My name is Valbona Nathanaeli from Albania. Thank you for your great speech. Very, very wonderful.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I have a question. One of the most sentences that I took with myself is education is not about flattering different cultures. And I agree. This means that we need to have some values that we have to keep strong in our education. And as a teacher, we have to specify what these values are. But at the gate of the schools, we have every day different groups with different values that knock at our doors and ask to introduce in the curriculum their values. And I found very difficult to resist, especially if the education has not enough money, is not enough strong to make this resistance.
Yeah.
So any
what to do?
comment
Yeah.
or suggestion?
So,
Thank you.
First of all, not all values are valuable.
Yeah.
Not all values are valuable. Just because I think well of myself does not mean that I should be flattered. Just because I am Jewish does not mean that I should only read Jewish texts, right, or texts written by Jewish authors. I would be very angry if a teacher said to me, "You're only going to read texts about Jewish identity." This would seem to me to be a fundamental betrayal. The director of schools in the city I live in is African American, Sonia Sontelisis, and she said to me, The challenge of education is that it must be both mirrors and windows. Mirror, yes, of the identity of African American children in Baltimore, because in the case of those African Americans in Baltimore, there has been a history of racism and suffering, which they are entitled to learn about, right? This has impacted their lives. But her important point is, if you stop there, it's hopeless, right? Then you simply reproduce the image of suffering. On the contrary, they must be introduced to the world, to the horizon beyond Baltimore, to the texts that come from faraway places and distant worlds and different imaginations. So we have to be very careful of the narcissism of individual differences, right? Very careful about the idea that because all of us look different and we come from different places, that the education has to be about each one differently. No, we have differences we live with our families, with our friends. We can live those differences. But education, if you believe in the humanities, is about what it means to be human. And that education is for everybody, or it is nothing at all. Thank you.
Thank you.